Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, some great perspectives there. Questions from the audience. Again, we'll take them in groups of 2 or 3. Richard, first.
Oh, hello. I'll stand up. My name's Richard Harding. I come from Oxfordshire. I'm very pleased to hear from Emily that the CBI are taking climate seriously. Oxfordshire has just approved in September its Oxfordshire Industrial Strategy, which goes out to 2040, which envisages massive road building, an industrial corridor between Oxford and Cambridge, massive road building, no mention of farming, no mention of forestry, little mention of the food industry or land management. What we're seeing is 20th century thinking in the 21st century. There is obviously, things have changed very rapidly, as you've said, in the last year, but there's going to be a huge lag in the system where these strategies, which all our planning is based on, still live 5, 10, 20 years ago. So how do we bring these things up to date to come to the realities that the recent IPCC reports are showing us?
Okay, thanks, Richard. Another question there? Yep.
Yeah. So I suppose following on from that in a way, I mean, I think a gap in the session thus far, so I'll try to fill it, is government policy. Insofar as it's been mentioned, we've talked about the Climate Change Act and positive changes and so on, but I mean, there's a side of government policy which is going in directly the wrong direction. So we have a licensing round taking place on the North Sea. Once those licenses are given out, that is for the development of new oil and gas resources. It takes years to develop an oil and gas field. So this is oil and gas resources coming into production at the end of the 2020s, and we're talking about 2030 being the turning point. So that is a part of government policy that's going in directly the wrong direction. The government signed up so I'm not even talking about party politics here, the government signed up in 2007, when I believe it was another party, to end subsidies for fossil fuels, but the government has obstructed the OECD the OECD monitoring of subsidies by adopting a definition that is so narrow that it excludes all the tax breaks for oil companies working on the North Sea. And just in case you didn't know, as taxpayers, 2015-16 tax year and 2016-17, I think the net transfer from the Treasury to the oil companies working on the North Sea was around £600 million. So, I mean, I call that not making any effort at all to reduce oil production. If we're not going to reduce it in a rich country, who's going to reduce it? Nigeria? Senegal? So that I think is, so that's first of all a question about government policy and just how dedicated is it really to the Paris agreements and climate change targets. But I think it opens up another broader question, which is that in this year that everybody's spoken about, where climate change has come to the top of the agenda, and a very good thing too, there seems to be fantastic scope for governments to acknowledge. So the problem to me isn't really Trump. The problem really is governments who on the one hand acknowledge that climate change is happening, and this is all the European governments, our own included, but at the same time refuse to get hold of the really difficult questions. And we're refusing to get hold of the oil industry, but you could go around lots of other governments and see a similar refusal. So in gatherings like this, is it not important to highlight this kind of cognitive disconnect? And you know, a lot of people here, the sort of people who are in a position to probably do something about it.
Okay, thank you. And at the back there.
Thank you. My question's mainly for Emily, if that's all right. But if the panelists have any ideas, I'd like to hear them. It's on the links between universities and the fossil fuel industry. So just taking Cambridge as an example, they were in the news a couple of weeks ago for taking £6 million donation from Shell, partly to go towards exploration projects, much like what Simon just mentioned, and also other interests like divestment. At Imperial College, the university that I'm from, we have extensive links with the industry still, including big investments and big investments in both directions, and also to the point that our president of Imperial College is in fact on the board of directors of Chevron, one of the largest fossil fuel companies in the world. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the idea that at some point universities should be saying, enough is enough. We need to, look at our links between the universities and the industry in perhaps a more critical light, and especially in the light of, the kind of maybe more recent things that have come out about disinformation campaigns put on by fossil fuel industry, and the idea that even though universities, especially Imperial is much the same, but putting on these programs, kind of meat-free Mondays and vegware, like compostable, single-use items, but also at the same time having these extensive financial links with the industry, and if they should be connected and addressed in a more kind of consistent manner. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I guess 3 related questions on the general theme of just how serious are we? It's about local plans, UK government and university links. So who would like to go first?
Shall I kick things off? Right, where am I going to start? So let me talk a little bit about business and whether or not they're taking action, government, and then I'll talk about Cambridge University in particular in light of the last question. So one thing that I really do think that big business is starting to recognise its role, at least in this country. Things like the task force on climate-related financial disclosures that you might have heard about has been really important in terms of raising the awareness of climate-related risks. But it's still the case that many are simply not doing any action commensurate with the scale of the challenge. One thing that I'm always reminded of, we had I won't say which one, but an automotive company a large automotive company came to Cambridge, and it must have been 4 years ago, because I gave a presentation to them with my now 4-year-old daughter crawling around on the floor in front of the presentation. And at the time we said to them, listen, your numbers just don't add up. You were claiming that you're wanting to do something, you're moving to a sustainable business, but it's not consistent. And so then we rolled forward to January this year, and that large automotive company wrote off £3.1 billion because they've been late to their game in getting into electric vehicles. So actually transition risks are very real for businesses, but especially when we look further down from big businesses to small and medium-sized enterprises, or on the policy level, if we look down at local or county governments, councils, I think a lot of times there's actually a real, quite understandable lack of understanding of what they can do if they really do want to respond to it, this agenda. We've already discussed some of the complicated issues around trade-offs in terms of different responses. What are the best responses? And can we try and help provide the evidence base in order to people to be making the right decisions in order to respond to this agenda? I think there's a real gap there. I think that absolutely the point that government policies are often not joined up. I mean, we see this across the board, and still a need, even in this country where we now have a net zero ambition, for the governmental policies to actually be put in place to back that up. I mean, we all know that that's not in existence. I think, actually the fact that environment and climate change, as you rightly point out, is suddenly from nowhere become an election issue is really helpful. Let's hope that actually pressure on our elected representatives through the democratic process might start to try and encourage action on that. But I absolutely agree that we ought to all be raising our voices as well, especially where we're in positions of having the evidence base that can help point in the direction of where those policies should be delivering the action to ensure that the numbers add up of the nature that we've been describing. On the very last point about where should universities be in relation to fossil fuel companies, so there was an article in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago about an investment, £6 million investment from Shell. What The Guardian didn't get right was that the research that's being undertaken in the university associated with that is research on carbon capture and storage, on green chemistry, and on what you might consider to be research towards moving us to a zero carbon world. And certainly my sense, and other people would have a different viewpoint on it, but my viewpoint is that we need to be working with all stakeholders, including those in carbon intensive industries, on research that's helping to support delivery of the zero carbon world. But exactly that issue of how should we going forward be engaging with carbon intensive sectors as a university, how should we be investing in those or not, is a very live debate within the university, and I'm sure it's going to continue. And on the research side of things, of course, there are tensions between academic freedoms and where you decide to direct your research. But at least in terms of what we're doing in Cambridge Zero, we're very clear that we'll only work, or rather obviously, on research that's supporting the delivery of a zero carbon future.
Thanks, Emily. Does anybody else want to come in on any of those? Go ahead.
Thanks, Richard. Some good questions. I think Emily's covered a lot of it, but the idea of not joined up policy or even opposing policy. So you've got the framework of the Climate Change Act leading to net zero now by 2050. You've got, until recently at least, fracking. You've got proposals for Heathrow terminal expansion. You've got, I think the big one though is the UK export finance, which invests in fossil fuels. Most of the money goes towards fossil fuels. So it's on the one hand saying one thing, and then it's the other hand acting on it, I guess. And so this is not just an issue for your BEIS, your DEFRAs. It's got to be Treasury. It's got to be the Ministry of Housing. You've got a huge amount of infrastructure. Heating, space heating is one of the biggest causes of emissions in the UK, and we've got very inefficient housing stock. And so there's things that other ministries need to get involved and start having policies in their areas, I think.
Very briefly, I'll disappoint you by not addressing the main question around joint-up policy making. But I want to make 2 points. The gentleman's question around the delay or the inertia of conventional policy making and whether it's appropriate, it's catching up fast enough. I think it's a very good point. And one of the things, it's these reports and the science within them is highlighted, how quickly science is advancing, and not just the science, the technological solutions as well. And some of the policies which we introduced not so long ago will needed careful consideration, because the technologies advance very, very rapidly, especially in the decarbonization of the energy sector. Not so long ago, when I first joined government, electricity market reform and coming up with a policy framework to provide support for low carbon generation, and then the changes that we had to introduce along the way, so the rapid change, technological advances has been immense. So I think it's a very fair, valid challenge as to whether the conventional way of approaching policy is appropriate. So I don't think we disagree on that. I won't go into the detail of any of the other aspects. It's not appropriate for me to do so at this point in time. One other thing I want to highlight related to this is capability and skills. So this is specifically related to local area and planning and some of the aspects. It's one project that I also was looking at how smart systems could impact heat decarbonization. And we worked with, to begin with, about 40 local authorities and whittled down to 3 to work together. This is from 2013 onwards. And ultimately, we did a trial. It was a very small demonstration project. And as part of that, we managed to get those local authorities to produce local energy plans. And one of the things we've uncovered along the way is that the lack of knowledge transfer. access to reliable capability and support around how some of the rapidly accelerating technology uptake is leaving some of the people behind. And capability is going to be an immense issue if we are to get anywhere close to the net zero ambitions that we've set ourselves.
Other questions? Yes. Okay.
My name is Leon Dumark. I'm an energy consultant. There's a question earlier about BECCS, and I'd like to refer to net zero and the SR 1.5, which, as Richard Betts was talking about the SSPs earlier, is based on RCP 1.9, not RCP 2.6, which the other two reports. So it's even tighter, and it involves a very large amount of negative emissions. And the question is, where are we going to get these negative emissions? Now, there's been an assumption in SR 1.5 by the modelers under the IMs that we're going to get it from BECCS. This is a fantasy. Yeah, this is sheer fantasy. The energy conversion rate in photosynthesis is so poor, it's just not worth using. So we're not going to get either sufficient energy to be useful or sufficient carbon capture from BECCS to be useful. And the idea that we're plugging these numbers in and saying that this is a solution is deluding ourselves. So the question is, where are we going to get these negative emissions from?
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yeah, over here.
I'd like just to pick up on points made earlier very briefly and hope they can sort of turn into a question that, for further comment. It was mentioned that when we first had reports on the climate problems, perhaps 30 years ago, it didn't achieve very much notice. I think one of the things within the UK that has made people notice more is the effects they've experienced more directly, starting with David Cameron in his Wellington boots in the Somerset levels, going through to the Whaley Bridge dam collapse, and then South Yorkshire. That brings it home to people far more than people clogging up Oxford Circus and that sort of thing, when they really experience it themselves, and the cost of it. Secondly, you mentioned, sorry, I'm pointing to for speed, what happens if you're a senior executive in a big multinational and you start doing things which are good for the environment but reduce your own company's profits and probably reduce your own life expectancy in the company. It really is, I think, a problem there. It really is a problem, I think, there when one company tries to do it on its own. I'm not sure what the answer is, but that would be one related question. And lastly, we are a little driven by fashion. I was involved initially with the development of the North Sea, later with trying to help companies in the motor industry to reduce their emissions across their whole fleet of vehicles by modern engine developments. And more recently, I've been asked by Shell, I'll name the company, I don't think it matters, to help them find some more sites where they can sell energy-efficient fuels. They're the only people who do hydrogen for cars in one or two locations, but they are trying to find still today more places for an old-fashioned fuel, liquid petroleum gas, which I use all the time in my own vehicles, and in fact, if not used, is just burnt off as a waste product, causing more environmental problems. So I just wonder whether the overall thing there is the basis of further comment.
Okay, thank you. So there's quite a few points in that, so we'll take the responses to those two questioners and then come back to the audience. Who would like to go first? Henry.
I could say something about CEOs, just very briefly, which is, if you talk to CEOs off the record, behind the scenes, about who have problems with externalities in their businesses, whether that's carbon, whether that's health issues with food companies, they basically break, in my experience, into two camps. There'll be one camp who will say, we need stronger government regulation. You have to give us stronger government regulation. It's the only way that we can make a change is you create a level playing field. And then the other group is the group that says they don't believe there's a problem, or argue that it's free market and there's no problem. And the only problem with the first group is that you'll get some people saying, and I think you have to be careful about how you do formulate regulation, that it is always the big companies that will ask for that, because they are the ones who will best be able to comply with, they'll have the departments that can look after the regulation. And when you do put in the regulation to help companies create a level playing field, you have to be careful you don't wipe out startups, entrepreneurs, small companies.
Emily?
Should I say something?
Yeah.
So let me say something about negative emissions technologies, first of all. So in a way, actually, I think these three reports that we have on the screen here did start a dialogue around negative emissions technologies. So as Richard already showed, the 1.5 report made it pretty clear that it's very difficult to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees unless you start to deploy negative emissions technologies. They sound ridiculous. It's a ridiculous name, isn't it? At large scale. And of course, BECCS was the sort of chosen version of choice from the modelling community. But what the second two reports, well, and to some extent the 1.5 report as well, started to explore was the trade-offs associated with that, and trying to understand, it's not just the effectiveness, but what are the unintended or consequences associated with those. And quite clearly there's still a long way to go to properly assess all aspects of that. Linking together with one of the other things that has been mentioned a couple of times already on the panel in terms of biodiversity and ecosystems, I think connecting up and looking in more detail at some of these nature-based solutions is clearly also a key research priority. You mentioned people's direct experiences of climate change, and of course one of the other key advances in recent years has been our advances in terms of our ability to undertake attribution studies, to look at extreme weather events that have actually occurred and to ask the question, has climate change to date increased the risk of those extreme weather events occurring? And I think that combination of both people's actual direct experiences, being able to understand a little bit more what the impacts of climate change may actually mean to them, together with our ability to go beyond just saying, weather and climate are different, but actually to say that some of these extreme weather events are being increased in their risk as a consequence of climate change has been very helpful. 10 days ago, a person who is MP for Doncaster North, and some of you will know who that is, emailed me and said, he emailed me on Thursday and said, on Friday I've got to give a speech in my constituency and I want to raise climate change. Could you give me some insight as to what climate change is most likely to mean for the constituents of Doncaster North? So I emailed him back literally at about 10 past 10 at night saying, well, for Doncaster North, probably the greatest risk is flooding. And then literally about an hour later, what hit the news, one shouldn't underestimate the real impact that those flooding. I mean, both in terms of loss of life, but also really horrendous long-term impacts on people's livelihoods. So yes, absolutely, understanding what the impacts on individuals are is incredibly important as well.
Any other responses?
Yeah, I'll have a go at Leon's question. So on the back, I mean, so all the scenarios, I mean, basically they all need to cut emissions really hard. So in the energy sector, getting out of fossil fuels, going to renewables, all that sort of thing. So, and, improving energy efficiency. So these are the sorts of things that NGOs broadly can say, yeah, we do that. Then, and depending on how fast you do that, changing diets, all these other sort of things that you might need, then you need a negative plug. You need something, and the models at the moment, as you say, they've chosen BECCS or large-scale afforestation as things that might draw enough carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So I think the points Emily's just made, that the ones that the NGO community could broadly rally behind are the so-called nature-based solutions, ecosystem restoration, halting deforestation, stopping conversion of grasslands, that sort of thing. I think BECCS, depending on the scale that you do it, there's no way you're going to do it on the scale that's looked at in the models. But it may be that you could do it in a smaller scale in particular locations, but certainly not the sort of planting bioenergy at the size of India type level. And actually, and the last point is that those sort of nature-based solutions, it's not just about the trade-offs, it's also about the synergy. So the land report in particular sort of looks at the I think it's called integrated land management, and so it sort of looks at all these different options and gives them markings. It wasn't one of the graphs that I saw earlier, but it might have been in one of the talks that I missed first thing this morning.
So one point worth making is that, as I mentioned earlier, that some impacts are already happening and having to start to adapt. If it turns out that we simply can't achieve these ambitious mitigation targets, then adaptation is going to be even more important, and that's another type of climate action we haven't really talked about yet, and sometimes isn't talked about much. The focus is often on mitigation. Obviously that's needed, but adaptation is already also in the mix, and probably increasing this. Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Henry, you made the interesting point of CEOs getting sacked for making no profit. And I think that kind of points to a more fundamental issue about how we built the kind of modern economy, which is the cost of the environment is obviously not built into that kind of profit equation. And hence you get the kind of split incentives, which I think is one of the reasons why this is such a difficult problem to solve. So my question really just for the panel is, where do you think we start in trying to get the environment to participate in the modern economy rather than relying on regulation and incentives, which more often than not are a very blunt tool to achieve that aim?
Thank you. And over there.
I like this session and the title of it. I think it could be altered into taking action in the appropriate time frame, i.e. maybe about 12 years. And on that basis, I'd like to ask what you think the biggest barriers are. In my mind, one of the biggest barriers has been and continues to be discounting, and the discounting factor that goes into the integrated assessment models, which means that action tends to be delayed because it's cheaper to start to act on climate change in the future. So really, if I sort of really push you, I'd like to understand how you think we value action in the next 12 years and how we overcome that value barrier. For me, we end up having far too much BECCS, like the previous questioner asked, principally because of the discount rate that we use and pushing action into the future.
Okay, thank you. Is there one other question? Yes.
A question which is fairly similar to all this. It would be very nice for us to have a choice and to know what we're choosing. If we do not account for our consumption emissions and merely do production emissions, I think we're missing a trick. And just to throw in the idea, the lawyers will come into very handy with attribution, and the insurance industry, I think, is probably very, very vulnerable at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Good point. So we should probably make answers fairly brief now. We're getting close to the end. So who would like to start? Emily?
Do you want me to go with some things?
Yeah.
Right, so I think the first two questions are quite well connected together. So there's starting to be a lot of work, including in Cambridge, about how can we go beyond GDP to try and measure progress, accounting for other factors, particularly natural capital, but also social capital, our own well-being in measures that are captured beyond just a simple measure of GDP. What are the right metrics that we should be using to judge progress by that take into account that wider set of considerations? And I don't have the answers, but I think it's an incredibly important piece of work. Some aspects of that does then feed into the notion of discounting, but in particular the notion of how do we account for future generations today, in the interests of future generations today. And I know that I was involved in some work with Ofgem, probably about, the energy regulator here in the UK, probably about coming up for a decade ago. And one thing that they did that I thought was really interesting and it really changed the perspective in terms of some of their decision making is they shifted to say that they weren't just representing the interests of today's consumers, but also of tomorrow's consumers. And when you take into account that, then your decision making becomes very, very different. And then I guess the final point, consumption emissions, yes, of course, but also the critical role of lawyers and whether that's going to start to change some of the landscape here. We've started just in the last few years to see organisations like Client Earth, for example, start to bring legal cases. And it's certainly the case that for the business community that we've been discussing a few times here, that task force on climate-related financial disclosures considers 3 types of risks for businesses. The physical risks to their assets and resources from the impacts of climate change, the transition risks, the sort of thing that I was mentioning about the automotive business not moving fast enough towards electric vehicles in their future, but also litigation risk. And I think that we are likely to see more and more of that in the coming years.
Okay.
Thanks. Good questions again. I think I'll just address the last 2 of them. So I think there's political timescales is clearly one of the issues that you have. So we are fortunate in this country that we have the long-term framework under the UK Climate Change Act. You have the situation though where a government can say, look, we've reduced our emissions by 43%, we're beating our carbon budgets, we're way ahead, without recognising that, okay, that's fine, but by 2025 you don't have the policies in place, you're not putting them in now because of the time it takes for things to enact to meet the future climate change budgets. But by then it will be some other Secretary of State who's on the hook for it. So it's the political timescales is part of it, I think. I think on the consumption versus production, that's a really really important point. And so we've done some work in WWF on this, not yet published, but DEFRA produce on a UK level an experimental statistic on carbon footprint, so consumption base. But what you can see from our work is that about half if we, the UK, if our objective is to end our contribution to climate change, at the moment about half of the footprint is not covered by domestic policy. So you don't have the levers here to do that. So you have to try and influence other countries to take action. That can only be done by leadership.
Okay. Henry, Demeter.
Very briefly, carefully picking questions. The question around challenge, so slightly different perspective. One thing I'd say is that the capability of achieving things on the ground. I say that is Tim's point around reducing the carbon impact of the economy by 40%. We achieved that mainly through attacking one aspect of the problem, which is the electricity sector fundamentally, which is, if you take the final consumption, 1/5 of UK's final consumption. Now that is, we've achieved that successfully through targeting large investments, building a few things, which requires few people to make big investment decisions and a policy framework to support it. But the next challenge is, even before we go into the complexities of, for example, greenhouse gas removals or negative technologies or BECCS, is to use the technologies that we have today to decarbonize the rest of the system, even before we go to the difficult ones, needs immense mobilization of capability and people. 28 million properties, for example, are becoming low carbon in terms of supplying their heating, needs a lot of work. And in a short time scale, that's an enormous task, even if we look at the UK's problem in an inward way. So we can imagine that even with some sort of a head start on certain fronts, how difficult it is. And therefore, for me, the actual capability, how and what people will convert themselves into a low carbon system is a big issue, big challenge. Even if we give all the other required regulatory policy framework is in place.
Okay, thank you. So we've only got a couple of minutes left, but Henry, did you have any brief final remarks?
Just briefly on the idea of costing and externalities, and also on production versus consumption. So the good news on externalities is that at a local level and environment more broadly, with the 25-year environment plan, the agricultural bill and the environment bill, if they go through Parliament, you have an ag bill that is switching from paying farmers based on the land they hold broadly for paying them for public goods, so you have a way of encouraging biodiversity. You have the environment bill, a commitment to polluter pays, so properly building in those externalities. And you have in the 25-year environment plan a commitment to natural capital, not only, and really importantly, there's not only stopping the decline, but rebuilding our natural capital. So if those things come past, we can look after, and are implemented properly by whichever government we get, we can look after our own environment. But then you have this issue of what you do about consumption and what you do about others. It's all very well looking after our patch of the world if everyone else is burning theirs. And there, I mean, I think personally, this is a personal view, I'm inspired by the work that Dieter Helm, who did the natural capital thing, but many others are doing on a carbon border tax, because the idea of a tax which, like VAT, encourages other countries to charge it in their country so that they can get the money into their coffers. If we could find a situation where you could get Europe and some of the other major consuming countries putting in a carbon border tax, that for me is the one piece of building in of externalities that quite cleverly pushes that carbon burden out. But you know, you probably, many of you will know better than me, there's a lot of politics to go through to get anything like that actually implemented.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're pretty much out of time. That's been a great discussion though. Thank you everyone. I just wanted to finish by saying a few words of thank you actually. First of all, obviously, thank you very much to the panellists for sharing their expertise and wisdom. Thank you to all the previous speakers, especially the lead authors and coordinating lead authors, anyone who's been involved in preparing these reports, because it is an enormous gargantuan effort. So well done everyone for delivering these. Thank you to you, the audience, for the great questions and discussion. Particularly thank you to the people who did the organisation of this meeting. So Simon and Alyssa from Grantham, Liz and her team, and especially Marcia and Susie. So Marcia Spencer is just, it's her last day in the Royal Met Star, having organised many of these meetings for about 10 years or so, is it? And Susie's now taking on her role. But if we could just give a big round of applause to Marcia for all her work. Thank you. I'm just going to hand over to Liz Bentley for a few final words. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, thank you for coming along to today's meeting. It's been a long day, but I think a very interesting day. Lots of speakers and panel, and as we've already thanked them, I won't do that again. We will email you out a feedback form. We run lots of events and meetings similar to this. Just welcome feedback from you on what worked, what didn't, what you'd like to see done differently, maybe what topics you'd like meetings on in the future, so that would be really helpful. A final reminder, we've got some briefing papers at the back, on the tables at the back, so please do grab those. There's briefing papers from Grantham Institute and the Royal Society. Please do take one. But a big thank you, and just to really wish you a safe journey home. Thanks very much.